You've just been listening to a wonderful piece of music by Romeo Scaccia, and it's his piece dedicated to Sarajevo. It's part of a much longer suite of music, which is really worth listening to. And it opens this session because of the power of peace in Sarajevo and how he has managed to capture so much of the dynamic that is necessary to build a beautiful world.
And so I have responsibility for leading a number of areas of the Foundation's work to help communities thrive after the conflict and to help us work through difficult conversations and provide the space for dialogue and some of the funding to be able to allow groups to have those conversations and support them through that. And yeah, as you said, we're 100 years into Northern Ireland, and never before has the need for dialogue been greater than it is at the moment, with things changing. It feels almost by the hour at the minute.
So, Michael, tell us a bit about you. What are your passions in life?
My passion in life at the present minute is cycling. I had to take up cycling because of an injury that I sustained when I was training I used to be a referee for the Gaelic Athletic Association. And for people who don't know that, it's one of the major sporting bodies in Ireland, traditionally associated with the Catholic tradition, and therefore has its own problems in convincing people that it's more than a sporting organisation. I'm also a husband, a father, and a grandfather of 5. And my biggest passion at the present minute is to get to America to hug my 2 grandchildren that I haven't seen for 3 years. And as Dawn knows, I can get very, very cranky every time one of your American airlines sends me a text to say your flights are cancelled. So when they send a text like that there, or an email, the advice is just to give me space for 24 hours to digest that, because it's been quite often. But me and Dawn actually go back quite a bit. Both in previous jobs. Dawn tells me that I pulled her out of a hole one time where the guest speaker at a conference didn't turn up, and I suddenly was the guest speaker unnoticed to me. So it's great. It's great that I was remembered for that, but I certainly don't remember doing that. But it's actually so me and her go back a long, long while, but we both had this passion around peace building and making our communities better places to live in and safer places to live in for everybody. So, and we're coming from 2 very different types of backgrounds and 2 different traditions, but that doesn't stop us having really good conversations, and it doesn't stop us having a similar goal to make Northern Ireland a much safer and much peacefuler place to live in.
Thank you, Michael. Tell us, could you give us just a little, background to the history of Northern Ireland? Not a history lecture, but not all of us may be aware of all, the main kind of situation and history there. If you could just spend a couple of minutes telling us, what have been the main kind of milestones?
I suppose, Barry, and this is really, it's back to the title of the conversation about truth and reconciliation, and it's important that we frame it like that. But I suppose, how far do you want to go back? Because Ireland has a great history of being plundered, looted, and a great history of plundering and looting as well. But I think for me, the biggest starting point should be the 1914-18 Great War. Why you call it a Great War, I don't know. But one of those things was that during that war, many people from Ireland actually fought for the British Army and died on the battlefronts. But our shared history isn't shared, because one part of our community will commemorate, remember, and honour those who died and who came back. And another part of our community, for a huge amount of time, and indeed a whole country, the Republic of Ireland, totally ignored it, totally demonized those people. And in many families, they weren't talked about. They were written out of their own family history. And it's slowly improving, but I think that's a good demonstration at an early point around shared history doesn't necessarily mean shared truth, and our capacity and our willingness to reconcile this truth with each other. But during that period, the Irish Republican movement seen an opportunity to try and overthrow Britain and get Britain out of Ireland with the 1916 Rising, which was very short, failed miserably, but had sowed the seeds then for a war of independence between 1919 and 1921, which again failed, and which ended up, as you said, Barry, at the very start, in the partition of Ireland in 1921. The 6 counties forming Northern Ireland, and the remaining 26 counties forming what was known, and is still known by many older people, as the Irish Free State. That sparked off a civil war in 26 counties, and it sparked off a sectarian conflict in the north. And it's an interesting thing that when we think about the amount of people who died in our conflict, inverted commas, between 1916 and 1922, there were nearly 2,500 people killed in conflict in Ireland, which we never actually, or very rarely, hear about or talk about. But the 2021 centenary is really important to recognise as well, because for people in what we would call the Protestant Unionist Loyalist community, it's a time of celebration, commemoration, and reaffirming the link to the United Kingdom. And for people, particularly within the Catholic Nationalist Republican community, this is a period of ignoring or re-imaging a new Ireland. But what's worrying for both myself and Don would be that on the periphery of that, there are threats to peace. There are people who will use this sense of identity as another reason for violence, and I think that's something we need to bear in mind as we move forward. And I suppose when I was doing a bit of research for this, I discovered something I didn't even know, that the Irish Free State was a member of the British Commonwealth until 1949 when it became a republic. And that's an outcome of my Catholic education. When I was at school, Irish history ended in 1916. And one of the things that we were actually taught about in school, or what we were told in school, was that you could tell a Protestant because their eyes were closer together. And that's
we're told the same.
So there's no doubt. So how do you know if we had 2 tribes in Northern Ireland with their eyes closer together, how did we ever manage to not bump into each other on the street? Moving forward, 56, 62, there was an Irish border campaign again by the IRA. But that failed, and because it met resistance on both sides of the border. And really interesting in that was that the Republic of Ireland introduced internment, which is prison without trial, and they introduced a special criminal court. And they became features of the conflict in Northern Ireland as we know it, through internment and through diblock. So internment and special jury courts were not new during our conflict. They had been used in Ireland previous to that. 1968, the Civil Rights Campaign, and that was really the first drive to try and get a peaceful effort for social justice and rights. But that met with huge resistance from particularly the security forces and the establishment in Northern Ireland. And that's a pity, because the Civil Rights Campaign was a rights campaign for everybody. And there were many Protestant working class families weren't able to vote, weren't able to get houses because of the issues around discrimination. And it's an example of how our truth has been twisted and not shared. But that resistance was a cue for the conflict in 1969, when the Troubles, the conflict, the war, whatever you want to call it, wherever you want to call it, actually commenced. Moved forward in 1973, and we had this thing, the Sunningdale Agreement, which was the first real attempt at power sharing. It lasted about 6 months, because again, there was huge opposition from the Protestant Unionist Loyalist community, and particularly an Ulster workers' strike, which in many ways closed down Northern Ireland. We come to that legacy, huge amount of work done behind the scenes, some very brave, courageous decisions, and that ultimately led to the 1998 Good Friday Agreement. I suppose that's the basis of our devolved assembly, which has a checkered history of in-out, years of no assembly, but pardon me for being cynical, full pay for our elected representatives for doing very little. And at this point, as we were talking earlier, we're still on the cups of potentially an assembly collapsing, because we today nominated first and deputy first ministers, and the first minister was nominated without the full backing, and actually with the major unbacking of his own party. So we're this could last a couple of hours, and we're looking at what might happen in the next couple of hours. But it's operating in a context of increasing tensions because of Brexit and the Northern Ireland Protocol. And that pits the UK identity of remaining British and part of the UK against border poll and the potential for very real first steps to United Ireland. So you have, it may have been, I don't think it was an intended outcome of Brexit or the protocol, but we are now in a very dangerous situation where there are extremes on both sides prepared to use identity again for violence. So personally for me, we are managing the peace. It hasn't been won, it hasn't been delivered, and I think it will take us very little to go back to violence, destruction and death. And there have been huge high-profile conflict atrocities. Unfortunately, all of them commemorated, or most of them commemorated and celebrated by those who committed them. And on the other hand, driving others into despair, grieving, mourning, and for a minority, an excuse for revenge. So I just list them off the top of my head, like Abercorn, Lamon, Omagh, Enniskillen, Bloody Sunday, Ballymurphy, Teban, Kingsmills, Loughlin, Greysteel, Loughgall, Warrenpoint, and you can go on. And the worst single event on the island of Ireland in one day was the bloody fighty bombings in Dublin and Monaghan. And they're all testament to the divergence of views, of truths, and the huge difficulties in any reconciliation process. And we need to remember the statistics, because behind those high-profile ones, there's a huge number of many more individuals, murders, loss, pain, hurt, memories, and lived experience. Nearly 4,000 people dead, 48,000 people injured, a huge amount of young people dying, and the fact that more civilians were killed in Northern Ireland as a result of the conflict than the combined total of the security forces and paramilitaries. And I think that has to be a constant reminder to everybody, I would hope to be, of the futility of conflict and its continued impact on how we live our lives in Northern Ireland and indeed on the island of Ireland. And just one final point around for me. Every day in Northern Ireland, so 365 days of the year, some family is remembering somebody who was killed as a result of the conflict in or about Northern Ireland. And for each one of those, I feel that truth needs to be told. And for each one of them, I feel that those that hold the truth need to tell the truth and come forward. The real truth, not a version suited to their cause. Because without that truth, for many, the families will still grieve, they will hurt. And I know in my estate, where I live in a small village in Donaghmore, there is a family still waiting for a member of their family to be returned because they're one of the people who were buried in an unmarked grave somewhere, they reckon, in County Monaghan. And for those families, if you ask them about reconciliation, that's not going to be a process that they want to embrace. It's not going to be a process that they want to engage. And because of that, personally, I think that that will ensure in Northern Ireland that reconciliation will be something that will be continually postponed until we get to that stage. That's my, and I'm very, that's my truth. That's my version. And other people will have different. If you ask 100 people in Northern Ireland, they have different versions. But for me, that's where I'm coming to. What drives me to do the type of work that I like to get involved in.
Thank you, Michael. That gives us great background, and I think that's given us the kind of key milestones that we need to have this conversation. I'm going to turn to Dawn now and say, in the context of what Michael said, Dawn, what does reconciliation then mean to you?
For me, it's lots of different things. It's not just about reconciling a person, a family, a community, but it's a society, and it's the fabric of society, and it's everything that goes with that. We become so focused in Northern Ireland on dividing ourselves into camps. You're either in a kind of a Protestant Unionist loyalist space, or you're in a Catholic Nationalist Republican space, and it doesn't take into account the fabric, the kind of the range of ethnicities that we have, of cultures that we have within Northern Ireland. So for me, reconciliation is more than just about your views. It's about your heart. It's about pulling people together, and it's about trying to create a better space where people feel that they can comfortably live, that they can express their views without fear of intimidation or recrimination, that they can freely move about areas without feeling that they are no-go areas or spaces that they should or shouldn't go in. But it's a space where we can celebrate our differences, and that we can enjoy the different cultures and learn about them, and kind of take part in different celebrations that may not be those that we've grown up with, but that's done in a way that we all feel that we can be included, and that where we want to express our differences, that we can do that respectfully and peacefully. So that kind of for me is where, when you say reconciliation, it's everything. It's not just about one thing. It's you can talk about who are we reconciling with and what and for what purpose, but for me it's everything, from individuals, from families, to community, to society as a whole. And in Northern Ireland, we have gone a long way on that journey. There is no doubt. We're 23 years, and that kind of some of the phrases that Michael used, I just wanted to pick up, like 23 years since the Good Friday Agreement, also called the Belfast Agreement, pulled together because we were in a conflict, the Troubles, or a war. And the fact that in using those words very quickly in Northern Ireland, people categorize you. You'll put you into a box. If you say this, then you could belong to this particular religious denomination. If you say that, you might belong to another. And I think what we've seen, and particularly, and I know it's the same in other conflict areas, but particularly of late in terms of language, we've just seen how divisive it is, and how we need to be even more mindful of the words that we use. I mean, we can't agree what we call the Belfast or the Good Friday Agreement. It's like having two of everything. And Barry, we had talked about before we come on the call about some things where in communities we have lived segregated. We do have different schools, we do have different healthcare centres, we do have different, two of leisure centres and of other places that we go, because that's the way our communities had to be set up in order to survive and to live and work through the Troubles. And so trying to dismantle all of those structures now is just extraordinarily difficult. And even 23 years after the signing of the agreement, when you feel frustration that you should be further down a line of reconciliation and of peace, we're not, and we haven't fundamentally dealt with a lot of the issues that have divided us. And Avala and I were on a discussion even just this morning around some of those tensions and issues that are in part because of Brexit and of the protocol, but are also a large part of the legacy and of our division and of our struggle to have the conversations around the issues that have historically divided us, and to try and find ways to move forward. There are, however, some really great examples of work that has happened. So I don't want this to be a call that's all doom and gloom, because there's fantastic work that's happened that Avla had led in her time as part of NIVT, and then laterally the Community Foundation, and kind of steps that have been put in place around programs and support and risk-taking work, because, you know, we kind of got the to where we are today if there hadn't been risks taken by the likes of Avla and others, and now, you know, hopefully by myself and others that are working on that in that area even more now as well, you know.
Yeah, we are very lucky to have Avila on the call, so
yeah,
we're in latest, because she has been, you know, the extraordinary pioneer of much of what's gone on there, and also Stephen Pitcham, who is on the call. I bring him in too, because he has done an awful lot behind the scenes and funding, but also was present at the night of the Ballymurphy massacre. So it would be good to hear from him. Where does truth fit into this, Michael? What's the, you know, because you said there could be no reconciliation without the people's truth. I think that was a quote from Mary McAleese.
Yeah, and it's an interesting one. It's whose truth is it? And how much can we believe in it, you know? And are we mature enough to that when the real truth is being told, that we are mature enough to actually accept that that is the correct version? Or are we still conditioned to say, well, if he or she said that, there's a motive for saying it, and it can't be right? And we need to have more mature discussion around and accepting that if something was wrong on our side, were the perpetrators of that wrong, let's hold our hands up and say, let's own it, rather than put the blame on somebody else or say that's a twisted version. And it's also interesting that there are many people who hold the key to the truth, but actually don't want to get involved in a truth process recovery. And the truth may never come out. I know one of the other things then, on top of that, it was something Mary McAleese said that night as well, that seminar as well, is that we may get the full truth, but because the people who then committed that injustice may not ever be brought to justice, does that actually create more injustice for the families who are seeking it? So there are very, very, very fine balances around that. But for me, the truth is, in the conflict situation, people who know what happened, be prepared to say what happened, be prepared to own their part in it, and not toe a line where, well, because was in this, or because I was not, this is our version, even though that version isn't the right one. And we don't have enough of that.
I think, though, the truth is different to everybody, isn't it, though, in that why people got involved in something, why they did what they did or committed the atrocities that they did. There was, for them, whoever that person was, there was a justification, there was a rationale, there was a cause, there was something that they felt strongly about, and that's why they did what they did. I'm not trying to condone those actions, but I suppose what I'm trying to say is that there's always at the heart of it, there's a reason, there's an issue, there's something that's happened that has pulled somebody down a particular path, and that is their truth. I think what you're talking about in some ways is the truth for those that have been left bereft or injured as a result of the violence that has happened, and them trying to find the truth, and the truth from those that committed it, whether that is state agencies, whether that has been the army, whether that's been the police, or whether that has been those that have been involved in further armed action as part of a cause, So I think it's so complex. Truth just isn't enough, There's so many layers to it. that I don't think that even having the discussion at times, unless you have the compassion and understanding too, and that's very hard for those that have been hurt and those that have been left behind by actions that have been committed by others onto them at times.
And, for me, my experience of the conflict has been very minimal compared to other people. But one of the key incidents for me that actually got me really into this work was the time of the hunger strikes. That's 40 years this year. It's a 40. And one of the hunger strikers lived about 5 miles from me, and I was actually secretary of the local sporting club, which operates up there. And I was representing the club at the wake. Was coming down the road, and all the hunger strike posters had been pasted onto an orange hall, which is part of the Protestant Unionist Lawyers tradition. I was taken out of the car and asked to remove the posters, and I said I wasn't. I was taken behind the hall, and there was a gun put to my head, and the trigger was pulled. Now my wife can say, and people remember that incident very well, because if there was ever a sign of white as a ghost, my face was white as a ghost when I came out of it. I was let go, and then a couple of miles down the road, I met 2 local elected representatives, stopped them, and we went back up and we asked the officer why they done that, and he said, "Done what?" And nobody in that in that unit said no. This boy's telling lies, and that was my trigger for saying there's got to be something bigger better for my children. That this is not a society that I would like my children to grow up in. So the truth is really important. And I fully ticked on that what Don was saying, that the truth for people getting involved is something that we need to hear as well, but we don't have enough of that. We don't have, and we don't find the spaces in many ways for people who have been involved in the conflict and have committed the conflict, and those who actually have been the victims of it, and even the victims. Who's a victim in Northern Ireland? And that's another, definition of a victim. Again, depending on what side of the conflict where you might be coming from.
Thank you.
Really interesting, Michael. Oh, sorry, Barry, were you going to say something?
No, you go.
It was just what
bring
you
the
said.
audience. I'm going to bring other folk in after this. Yeah.
It was just what you'd said, Michael, around creating a better life and space for your children and grandchildren. And despite being 23 years on since the signing of the agreement, we have those ceasefire babies, those kids that have been born since that has been signed. But in some communities, they talk about the troubles and they talk about the conflict as if they grew up in them, that intergenerational trauma and that kind of cycle of pain and hurt that goes down from generation to generation. And sometimes you have to pinch yourself when you're talking to some of those young people who talk about the troubles as if they actually lived and breathed it, and you have to remind yourself that they were too young to have even been part of that. And so part of the work that we need to do is try to break that down, to put in support and programs that can change that cycle and that can show that there are alternatives, there are better ways, and to put an end to the need for paramilitarism, to put an end for paramilitary recruitment, and particularly amongst those most vulnerable young people as well. So I think that whilst we have had in the last 23 years relative peace, from what we have had, we've not had those major atrocities that we've seen in the past, some of which you'd mentioned, we are still in a very fragile place. And I think recent events, have demonstrated just how fragile we are and the work that still needs to take place, and that you can't, in peace building work, you just can't take your foot off the pedal, because there's always something else that's going to be coming forward, and it's just how you can be proactive as opposed to always being reactive as well, in and around how you have the tools, the programs, the support to help others, to allow those conversations to take place, to move us forward as a society.
And you're Northern Ireland is very fortunate to have the Community Foundation for Northern Ireland, which has been a staple in a crazy world, you know, where there's been an organizational focus that has actually been thinking about this, and is actually genuinely a non-partisan, because its trustee board is actually made up of people from both traditions, and was actually formed by people from both traditions. Thank you. You'll get a chance to talk a bit later, but I'd like to bring some people in. So the floor is now open, and if I don't get an immediate kind of a request, you can put your hand up. You can just wave at me. I'm going to pick on somebody if I don't get a response very soon. Okay, I'm going to go to Basma. And Basma, we're very lucky to have you on the call. You're, along with Michael and Dawn, an amazing peace builder, but in a completely different context with your work on Syria, where you've been devoting your life for at least 10 years and been the spokesperson for the national opposition, among many other things. How does some of this conversation resonate with you?
I think I catch a few sentences because they are so key to I guess, everyone involved in a conflict. One of them is there are so many layers to the truth. But then what do we draw from this sentence? I think we draw, I mean, I want to live with the illusion that you can start without addressing the truth, because those different layers, you're never going to get over each party's or each person's truth. So I'm still perplexed by the process of seeking truth because probably we are in the middle of a conflict. My other point, I think, here is also what resonates with me is who's a victim? Who is a victim? Who is the victim? Some people will say, and we have said in previous discussions, everyone is a victim in this. It doesn't help, right? It doesn't help the victims who think there are perpetrators out there. Are we all victims of an international or an external process? I think we also heard that we should own the problem and not deny that. Not say it's somebody else's problem. It's somebody else's responsibility. I mean, that is where we are today in a conflict like Syria. Is how do we own the problem, the conflict, the reasons for this conflict? Because the outside reasons, we can't do much about them. But is there a way of starting with the ones that we control and that we acknowledge, recognize, admit? And from there, does that give us some autonomy to look at the issues between the parties? And then, of course, we have the sort of very concrete, logistical impediments to this kind of communication. So that's where we are in the conflict in Syria. It's very difficult to put together the parties because we have a dictator. Unlike Northern Ireland, the conflict in Ireland, we have a dictator who prevents anything like this from happening. So that's where we're stuck. I'll leave it at that, Barry. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Basma. Let's turn to Avila. You've been in this field for a long time, and were one of the founders of Foundations for Peace, which has an international dimension. And I mean, we're the director of the Community Foundation for Northern Ireland for 20 years and have been closely involved. How do you feel about things now? And what's the relationship between truth and reconciliation? And, you know, how do we make progress here? You know, I've got some easy questions if you like them.
Well, as both Michael and Dawn has said, it's the situation is very fraught at the moment. So you never feel that confident when you're in a situation like that. The Brexit and the growth of English nationalism has actually helped create the difficulties that we're facing at the moment. But in fairness, I think they probably were always going to come because of the fault line compromise in the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, as Dawn says, we have two names for everything, which basically said that that the agreement is dynamic. It's not a formal settlement, in that the constitutional future of Northern Ireland depends on a border poll, and we have a binary option of either reunification with the south of Ireland, or in whatever form, or maintenance within the UK. So that was always going to be a fault line, to be quite honest. And Brexit then just made it worse. And we're seeing now, I think, a real difficulty, because we're seeing unionism and loyalism in its different manifestations to an extent imploding, and suffering from a severe lack of leadership and a lack of alternative vision. So that's the current situation. I mean, in terms of truth, I mean, I agree with a lot of what's been said. Whose truth? Where you locate it? If you're a Protestant farming family on the Fermanagh border, you see the conflict as forcing you out. People there would talk about almost like a genocide. That's an exaggerated term, but that's true. That's their truth, as against, say, a family in Ballymurphy in West Belfast, which is a strong Republican area, who would have a very different view. I do think, and I speak, I suppose, as an historian by training, there is a real importance about the documentation of history and about a shared history. I mean, as Michael says, we're all taught in Ireland, we're all taught history in different ways. I was at school in the south of Ireland, and I knew the history probably of 3/4 of the countries of the world, but not of England, and vice versa if you were in a state school in Northern Ireland. But the one thing we know about history is that it's written by the victors and it's written by the powerful in most cases. So I think, you know, in whatever, and it's not just Northern Ireland, that's true everywhere, wherever we are, it is important to create a people's history, albeit that there will be different. I always talk about it as a bit of a kaleidoscope in terms of truth. But sometimes I think we can be overly sort of say all-encompassing in terms of, inverted terms, tolerance. And actually, in conflict situation, there are hard truths that need to be documented and written and addressed. You know, it's all very well for, you know, Europe to cheerfully sort of say, talk about Adolf Hitler, and everyone agrees that is awful. You know, sometimes the way we talk of our other conflicts, we sort of say, oh, well, everybody's a victim, everybody's suffered whatever. Well, actually, there is an inequity in terms of suffering and the ideologies that are behind that. And I think that has to be hit headlong in terms of sort of saying, well, actually, there are certain things that are unacceptable. I mean, Rasha's on the call. We've just seen the Israeli-Palestinian situation again. I mean, there are certain truths that cannot be avoided because we want to be tolerant and completely inclusive. In terms of reconciliation, and I veered away from that word in terms of Northern Ireland. I talk about conflict transformation easier because I think it tends to be a middle class concept sometimes, or a religious concept. and it can be imposed on those that have suffered the most. So for me, I would talk more in terms about, as far as possible, an understanding of what happened, but that depends on all parts, all combatants being involved in that. We have not seen the British state, for example, allowing records to be disclosed. In fact, the opposite in the Northern Ireland situation. I think it's about giving space to change, for people to change, for viewpoints to change. And we have seen a huge, in many cases actually, some of the change makers in terms of getting us to a peace process were those that would have been absolutely sort of sidelined and indeed silenced as the prime combatants. We need to, as Michael says, get over our codes, because we speak all the time in code, so as not to upset others. And to escape the mental mind maps that we have. I think it was Michael actually a number of years ago talked about that we all carried a mental mind map of how to get home without going into the other's area. That was never articulated in terms just of safety. And we need then to actually look at where are the areas that are still silenced. There are, despite all what's written about Northern Ireland, there are still people that are silenced. For example, the families of people that were shot as informers or alleged informers within their own communities. The families are the individuals, women that were tarred and feathered because they formed a relationship with the wrong person, be it a British soldier or somebody from the other side, whatever, that wasn't acceptable. Those people haven't even spoken yet. So it's actually looking at all the time. And I suppose the last thing I'd say is, something about also reconciliation, but more in terms of trying to create some shared vision or understanding of the type of society that we're working towards, but not imposing it in a time-limited fashion. We want to be here in 3 years' time, and we have this policy which talked about bringing down our peace walls in 10 years' time. And I always called it a minuet of mutual deception. It sounded good, particularly to the Americans. We all knew it wasn't going to happen. So actually being realistic and actually taking those people who are at the interfaces and are still uncertain, to taking their pace of change rather than externally imposing it.
Thank you, Evola. That's layers upon layers of complexity there. And I mean, I think reframing the idea of reconciliation, I'd like to call in Rasha in a minute from Palestine to see how this discussion is playing out in her mind in a very different kind of conflict. But first, I'd like to go back to Truth and draw on Stephen. Stephen, you have been recently playing out Truth in a courtroom, and I'd like to hear a bit about that, because you were in the Ballymurphy estate on the night of the massacre in 1971, and we discussed this at length a couple of years back when you'd been subpoenaed to appear in court. But I'd also like your wider take, because you've been such an incredible peace builder in Northern Ireland. So how do you see Truth, and how is it for you?
Well, I'm very cautious about saying much, because of course my deep involvement in Northern Ireland was back in 1971 to 74. And then, of course, more recently, as a funder of trying to think about the way forward. But it is interesting because there's a dimension that I've been thinking about as everyone's talked, and the complexity as to why I went to Northern Ireland in 1971, which was coming out of the peace movement in the UK, and thinking, look, here we have, whether you say it's in your own country, i.e. the United Kingdom, or at least part of the geographical formation of the United Kingdom, a significant conflict. And I went, you know, as part of a group of people who were connected to kind of a Gandhian way of thinking about nonviolence, actually, as a way of trying to promote change. And, you know, we operated on an analysis of what was going on in Northern Ireland at that time, which I still feel has quite a lot of significance. And that was to say, here we have a conflict. The power holder that has been the United Kingdom, has been the UK government. And you have got two communities, and what we felt was that those two communities were kind of very, very distinct and separate, as we've heard in so many ways tonight. But the actual approach of the British government at that time was to actually try and push the middle ground. You know, a middle ground that was more or less non-existent. And the only way it could push the middle ground was to actually more or less decimate the extremes that they saw, where they saw the problem was, you know. So the reason why this has been much in my mind was because, as Barry said, I've been subpoenaed to give evidence at the Ballymurphy inquests. And I've been thinking actually about Brigadier Kitson, who Avila may remember, and maybe Michael will remember. But I've been looking up Brigadier Kitson because he was the person who had the military strategy for what was going on in Northern Ireland. And I've just seen on his Wikipedia entry that he was given a CBE in 1972 for his services to peace in Northern Ireland in 1971. And of course, in 1971, he was the person that basically sent the paratroopers into Ballymurphy to more or less, you know, subjugate that community, you know. And I mean, there was I as a young English volunteer living and working in that community, constantly being, you know, harassed and you know, beaten up by the paratroopers, who'd basically been sent in to really subjugate that community. And of course, it was the same soldiers that were then sent into Derry, you know, the next year. And so two of the most significant, you know, real problems were created by a policy that was to actually hold down the extremes. And I think it was Michael that mentioned the Ulster Workers' Strike, which was in a sense the same element, you know, that the British government wanted to actually stop any sense of those two communities organising. So, you know, and one of the things that I think the Community Foundation and others have done so well has been to try and say, well, actually, we've got to actually listen to these communities and to think about what they're saying and where they were at. And that was largely a part of the kind of thinking, the underpinning of the process, of the community development process, about helping people to actually operate on their issues of their daily lives, you know, whether it was about housing or transport or whatever. And then trying to almost create some kind of community politics that which actually, you know, would cross that sectarian divide. Now, we were arguing in 1971, actually, that there had to be some kind of way of looking at what some of the loyalists were saying at that time, which was about an independent Northern Ireland, and also about what the Republicans were saying, which was saying, yeah, there needed to be a united Ireland, free of Britain, but that it might be done on the old 4 traditional provinces. So there would be some kind of structures that would actually, and you know, it was interesting just to toy with those ideas about, you know, some of the more radical Protestants talking about wanting to have an independent Northern Ireland, and the radical Republicans talking about, you know, a framework of a united Ireland within which you might have a devolved region. Our sense was that it had to be the people from those extremes that would actually be brought into the power sharing, that would have to do the deal. And in some ways, I think that's exactly what happened. In terms of the peace process, because it was the, well, what's happened has basically been that we've got Sinn Féin and the DUP that actually eventually did the deal and were there. What I struggle with now, and what I'm out too far out of the context to actually know, is where you move forward on peace and truth from there. Because in some senses, some of the critics of what was happening around the peace process were, of course, saying that this is going to, it's going to make rigid those sectarian divides. And to some extent, at a political level, it feels to me that that's where we've arrived at, a kind of, a lack of real understanding of what's common in the community, and actually thinking about what the differences are. And of course, Brexit for me has been absolutely disastrous. It's been disastrous because of the English nationalism that Avila has mentioned here on this side of the water in England. But it's been particularly disastrous, I think, for Northern Ireland and Ireland, because the European Union provided a framework where the Irish government and the British government could actually look outside of their historic context. They were both members of this union together, and it gave more of a balance of equality. And I think that was so important in terms of thinking about where the future of Northern Ireland was. So actually involving the Irish government so well. So what I don't know now is where, how you move forward in a way from there, because I think everyone has talked about the fact that obviously the idea of some form of referendum must be around. I think just thinking about what that would mean, in terms of thinking about whether, how do you decide when to hold such an event, and what would it mean in terms of what are the options and things like that. Those are the sort of areas which it feels to me from the distance that I'm at now need really to be thought through. Because it feels to me that there is obviously a dynamic now. There's a dynamic in the whole of the United Kingdom. I mean, we don't know what's going to happen. We talk about the disunited kingdom, movements in Scotland, I think inevitably movements in Northern Ireland. A growing sense in Wales also of wanting to rethink, how things are organized. So, if we could think of a way we could move in that direction, then, and think creatively, that would be wonderful. I don't know whether the level and depth of thinking around that is well enough. So, Barry, that's my response really to thinking about what's been said in the context of me just having had this experience of really thinking about what happened in Ballymurphy, and the fact that I feel that, again, it's almost the British response which has been the most ineffective. Johnson apologising in Parliament, what's he apologising about? Is he apologising that it was the policy of the British government and the British Army to actually, subjugate those communities to the extent that they were prepared to kill innocent civilians, and to allow that to go on for 50 years without any real recognition of that? You know, where is any critique of Brigadier Kitson and what he was doing at a military level? So, you know, what the idea of truth at this point is you know, the truth has come out now for those Ballymurphy families. They've waited 50 years for to be told that their relatives were innocent.
Something they already knew.
Something they, of course, already knew. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Stephen. Meditations on truth. Really powerful stuff. Thank you very much. And truth is often inconvenient if you hold political power. Rasha, are you lurking there? You're muted and I can't see you, but I'd love to hear from you and see how this, you know, as a Palestinian activist, how are you feeling about this discussion? How does it play with you and your situation?
So yeah, thank you, Barry.
Could you put your camera on, or is your internet too weak?
My phone is okay. There we go.
There you go. Yeah. Hi,
Rasha.
Wisdom. Yeah, I'm absorbing all of this conversation, but I'm thinking that I'm coming from a community foundation background, working in a community foundation. I'm thinking along the lines of the community deciding. So I believe in the role of communities and that bring about change, and they should be involved in decision making. What I'm trying to say is that, for example, the Dali Association, the Palestinian Community Foundation, we believe that there won't be any true peace without seeking social justice, which is part of the belief of the Foundations for Peace, which is what Dalia and CFNI and many other people on this call are members of the Foundations for Peace. So yeah, there can't be peace without social justice. So through our work, as Avila mentioned, we work on the community to achieve self-determination. Because if the community doesn't know how to decide, how to convene, how to organize, there won't be any understanding of justice and equity and fairness and social justice. So in order to do that, we work through community giving and community grants. So this is how we believe we achieve this social justice. But coming now, and we feel like this has a great impact, especially to the events, the recent events that happened here in Palestine, especially regarding the truth. So for the Palestinian context, it's quite simple. For us, the truth, it's not for us, it's the truth. It's a settler colonial apartheid regime. And Palestinians are finally being listened to, and they're not being listened to on traditional media like CNN, BBC, or with some exceptions. They have been given some time slots, but we are going to social media to create, to get more attention to the injustices by this apartheid regime. So the truth is circulating there, but at the same time we are being silenced under the pretext of anti-Semitism. So what I'm trying to say is we are at a stage of a conflict that is very different from Ireland's, Northern Ireland stage of conflict. And I feel like what I'm listening to here, truth is very important. And even as Dawn said, the term itself for us, conflict for us is, it really demeans what it is, because it's not a conflict. It's more of a settler colonialism. It's people trying to defend their land, trying to defend their rights, their basic human rights, access to water, all of that. So it really is about definitions. And yeah, this is my point. I hope.
Thank you. Thank you.
I hope.
Yeah. I mean, conflicts that sometimes do not permit for reconciliation when they're not of that kind, when they are simply it's a one-way bargain, and there is no possibility of actually negotiation in those kinds of terms. Christopher Harris, listening to this discussion, you're part of something called Philanthropy for Social Justice and Peace. Do you have any kind of perspectives on this?
Thanks, Barry. Yes, my brain's been spinning as the conversation's gone on, but in a different setting. We're all talking about our own contexts, and I'm thinking of mine. While we're on this call, I happened to look at an alert that came in from the Washington Post. Then I'll read it to you. It says, Republican congressman refuses to shake hands with DC police officer who protected the Capitol on January 6th. And I was struck by Michael's framing about the notion of have a mature discussion of the truth. And for me, in all the context that's been talked about so far, the absence is our ability to identify a more just truth, understanding that there are, defining justice depends on where one sits, et cetera, as Avila pushed out. But here's the thought. I'm struck by all of us in our context, Russia and Palestine, Stephen echoing the question about what about Brigadier Kitch? I mean, where is he? Why don't we know about him? Who controls our various discourses? And I'm thinking about the incredible power of media, especially the growing power of right-wing media, not only in the States. I read a piece a few days ago about the equivalent of Fox News in France, a right-wing, increasingly powerful. Basma, you're nodding your head. It's a phenomenon we're seeing all around. I mean, the conservatives in Britain have their own ability to spin out truth. But when I'm thinking about our scale, we all struggle with local truths and relationships. But there are some forces much bigger than the story that Michael told about the policeman pulling him aside and putting a gun to his head, saying to tear down the posters. I have examples about that in the Black community in Boston, where I used to live. We all can cite such examples, but those are the micro, the local that I'm thinking of. But I'm reflecting on the power of massive media, the Murdochs around the world and people like them who have disproportion, that's not strong enough a word, have an oligarchic power in terms of how people think and intentionally keep us from getting to the truths. We don't hear about the Brigadier, Stephen, because people are actively keeping us from hearing. So that's my reflection, is how do we, many of us who try to look at local activity, deal with this immense, larger contextual, muscular media control that forces agenda that makes our work even harder.
Thank you. That's yeah. So we're all living in an oppressive context that actually feeds a pack of lies, basically, and the kinds of distortions that keep the status quo for a minority and breed hate and xenophobia everywhere. John, have you got anything to say? I mean, I know that you run programs around peace and so on. How does this discussion fit with you?
Thank you, Barry.
You're on a beach, mate. You're on a beach. Goodness.
I'm sitting in my office.
Right. Okay.
seriously, I am sitting in my office, but my background happens to be a beach, because it's a nicer background than where I actually am.
Yeah.
I mean, first of all, this conversation has been so kind of sobering, really, kind of illuminating as well, but kind of really sobering. Unlike many of you, you know, I'm just a geezer from South London. You know, these conflicts in Northern Ireland barely affected me. The conflicts in Palestine, they don't affect me. Conflicts in Syria don't really affect me. So it's really kind of illuminating to kind of hear people speak about those kind of lived experiences. Because, and Chris, you're absolutely right. You know, we get fed what the oligarchs in the media want us to hear. So the kind of notions of truth within that are really kind of difficult because we don't get to hear all the stories. And one of the questions I do have, actually, particularly around sharing different truths. I should say, actually, many of you know that I advise a wealthy family on their philanthropy. There are 8 children in this family. Each one has told me their deathbed story. This was Daddy's final wish. And of course, each of those is both true and a complete pile. You know, so, you know, they are true. Sure, they're true. People fervently believe them, but they are very different, and they can't all clearly be true. But one thing that does strike me is that where voices are heard, people are able to tell their stories. One thing that does strike me is who is listening. Because if these things are just happening in courts of law, you know, those are fairly kind of closed spaces. If we are interested in systemic change, if we're interested in, Dawn, I think you spoke so well about this. You know, what does transformation, what does reconciliation mean? It's a kind of, it's societal wide, that whole kind of fabric of society at all its different kind of levels. You know, who is listening? We don't hear enough about it. And that's me as a kind of British citizen, but those people who are in power at in Westminster and elsewhere, you know, we don't hear their reactions to any of this. Are they listening? Who is listening?
Good question, John. Right. So who would else? We've got Joanna, Sari, James, Stuart. Would you like, any of you like to come and say how this discussion is going with you? I'm just conscious we're getting towards the end, and if you'd like to come in, I'd love you to, but you need to unmute yourself and speak. Anybody? I mean, you don't have to. No. Jerry, did you want to say something?
I was struck. Thank you all for your very profound and very sobering reflections. One of the things that worries me is the kind of group we're in now is a group of people that are speaking very, I think, comfortably but truthfully to one another. And it's frankly why the multitudes thing got started. What doesn't bother me exactly, but it perplexes me why this doesn't grow. That it's sort of that we have the same people. I love you all, and honestly think it's important that we do have the same people, but it's not growing. And just addressing the question of who's listening. Are we in sort of echo chambers where we only really are able to do this kind of truth speaking. And I completely accept what Avila and I think Dawn were saying at the beginning about the fact that truth is multifaceted. People hold different truths at the same time and all the rest of it. But still, the idea that a group of people can talk about very difficult issues and resolve, at least momentarily, some of the tension is something I really believe in. Now, my experience has been always at a distance, but I do remember when we were reunifying child soldiers who had been who had committed horrible atrocities in Mozambique with their parents, that one of the things that had to happen was that the parents themselves had to decide almost to invent culture, to find ways of forgiving the children for burning people in their huts, for killing people. And there was an incredible conspiracy of narrative creation or culture creation to deal with the problem that I always found powerful. And it was in fact Mozambican women who kind of invented culture to find ways to reintegrate their children back into villages. And it's something we never talk about. We don't talk about also the need for some illusion. I liked what Basma said, some illusion that actually you can fix things. Because if you're forever grounded in the pain of the moment, what do you do? So I'll stop there. I mean, these are just some of the thoughts that are going through my head.
All right, thank you, Jerry. I think it's one of the frustrations I have about in the peace building world is that we do have great insights, but we have very great difficulty in getting outside to get it into the minds of South London boys, and that there are media distortions, but how many of us kind of live a life on the surface and not really try to get beneath that? And this venue was all about trying to have difficult conversations in open and caring kind of ways. And in a sense, one hope it would grow, but this is the work. I mean, these kinds of conversations need to happen, and we need to kind of keep going and find to get some kind of breakthrough. I mean, I've been involved with Avila I think it's 15 years maybe now with Foundations for Peace. And it's really, we've never managed to get traction in the peace industrial complex, the Geneva UN settings. I've been there once, and people don't think this way. They're all into the latest top-down program working with their governments, even with the fact that all of those kinds of initiatives never really stick or get anywhere. So there is a job to be done, and I think I've been talking with people this morning about how a real kind of thing that needs to happen is a critical change in consciousness, because we can run all the programs we like and run all the kind of grants we like, but unless something deep within us actually transforms, I don't think the human being is ever going to make progress, because we are going to subject ourselves to confirmation bias. I mean, the conflict in Northern Ireland goes back to 1690 and before. I mean, this is not a new thing, and it could go on for another 400 years. I'm going to give just a minute to each of you, Dawn and Michael, before I then close out the meeting and thank people for their time. So, Dawn, would you like to just give us any final thoughts?
Yeah, it's been a good conversation for me, and just hearing just from others. I was thinking about what Basma had said at the beginning. It's a bit of us trying to understand and own the problem, to start somewhere, to do something, however small. And I suppose a bit like what you just said, being that change that we want to see. Each of us playing our part within that. And I think if we were all doing that, then, kind of it leads to great things. I was also thinking about what Jerry had said around, I suppose maybe it was a little frustration as well around how, the conversation and it growing. And I suppose for me, the question is, where is it we wanted to grow to or into? Because I know from where I'm sitting, the conversations are growing and those hard conversations are being had in the spaces and with the communities that we want to have those conversations with. And I suppose part of it is creating the space to allow that to happen, and some of that's happening privately, but also in the place that and at a pace that they're most comfortable with. And I think the other one then was Christopher Harris, just around the role of the media, and I think what's missing from that is the role of social media today. And we've certainly seen the power of social media, and I suppose when we're talking about truth, we've really seen not just how mainstream media, but in particular how quickly social media changes a story, and how truth is really just that inconvenience, and how it has very much disrupted communities and led to and incited violence as well. So I think when we think about media, it's there's the mainstream, but there's also the growing movement in terms of and power of social media that it just becomes so very difficult to get a handle on.
Thank you so much, Dawn. Final sentence or two from you, Michael.
Yeah, thanks for everybody for contributing. It's been really, really fascinating. And I'm really struck by what you said, Jerry, about us talking to ourselves most of the time. And myself and Dawn have had numerous conversations about how can we broaden this out to people that we don't talk to normally, and take it. I think that's important. And Don said something earlier on also about things are just not as gloomy as I may have painted them to be, because in the midst of the pandemic, we had the community sector crossing barriers, crossing boundaries, going into areas where they'd never been in before or never were invited in before to help others because people were in need. And there's something, how can we bottle that? How do we not lose that energy where people have done that to help others in need? And somebody mentioned, I think it was Avila was saying about reconciliation. And myself and Don actually had this conversation when we were planning this as well. Because the definition of reconciliation really assumes that you were friends in the first place. And quite a number of people in Northern Ireland were never friends to be reconciled with. So maybe we're starting with the wrong word, and maybe we're starting in the wrong place. And maybe we need to think about just cranking it back up, cranking it down to crank it back up again.
Thank you, Michael. That's very insightful, both from you and Dawn. This has been a fabulous session. I'm not downbeat. One of the things that I'm involved with Russia in is something called the Shift the Power campaign. And that shows that things can be done, because across the world, people are beginning to wake up. They are beginning to wake up in oppressed communities to their own power. Russia gave a talk at on an alliance seminar a week or so back about how she felt as a woman in a Palestinian situation as an activist, and how that was driving her forward. And I think if we do join together, things can change. And I was talking this morning with Joanna and James on a call, and we were talking about the work that we all need to do inside ourselves. And how we can actually transform ourselves. And there's no real gap between inner and outer in this world. And that if we can think agency for ourselves and build our own power, the right kind of power, the transformative power, that is not just about me, but it's about us. The African notion of Ubuntu, that I am because you are. We need that in the world, because we are all one world, whether we like it or not. Physicists tell us this. If you doubt me, read David Bohm, Wholeness and the Implicate Order, where he talks about how spirituality and modern physics, and he was an expert in quantum mechanics, actually come together in something called consciousness. And it's consciousness that we need to think about, because the older I get, the more I think about what is deep inside us as people, when we reach into that deeper caring part of ourselves, the one that is not on the surface, not the left brain easy stuff, but the deeper kind of spiritual side, if I can put it that way, the deeper kind of presence that we all have if we care to see it. And it's not about necessarily about words and language, because words can get in the way, as we've seen. You know, we can't agree in Northern Ireland whether it's Derry or Londonderry, or whether it's the Belfast Agreement or the Good Friday Agreement. That in a sense we need to get into the ineffability of experience. And I just want to close. We opened with a wonderful piece of music dedicated to Sarajevo. We weren't able to play it all, but we will actually circulate where you can get that music from. I'd like to finish with something that I played after the first time I had this conversation with Dawn and Michael, and I found it a very rich, inspiring conversation, and it gave me hope. And I thought, well, how do I search for peace within myself? Peace, not the absence of war, but peace in a different kind of harmonious sense, a sense of being deep and content and fulfilled. And I sat at the piano, as I did, for 2 minutes and 47 seconds. And I'm going to play it to you now. And it's my journey. And I listened to it, and it starts in an 18th century drawing room in Vienna, and it stops on a train on the south side of Chicago in 1943 as it reaches for the promised land. So this is searching for the peaceful land. Okay, thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Larry.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. See you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks.
Oh goodness, what did I say? Are we recording this?
Yeah.
Yeah. What you've just listened to is a piece played and composed by Romeo Scaccia, which is just a brief extract from a longer piece called, holy shit, I've forgotten what it's called. From a longer piece dedicated to Sarajevo, which shows the beauty and grace of oh shit, I forgot what
Don't worry, take three, this is my fault.
it's all right. The trouble is I'm always there in the moment.